I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in North Georgia. It's a lovely area with hundreds of miles of national forests, excellent state parks, and plenty of great camping sites. Unfortunately, my hometown is also quite poor. While there are some residents from Atlanta and nearby cities, many people around here struggle financially. I work as a freelance technical writer, which allows me to do most of my work online. If I didn't have this option, I would need to relocate. It's just one of those small towns that can sap your ambition if you stay too long without something else going for you. Aside from a few doctors and lawyers and some workers at the local power company, the job options are mainly at Walmart, fast food restaurants, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town is a vast national forest filled with great camping spots and many little used hiking trails. I love hiking there with my dog, but it can be a bit unsettling at times. It's about a 10-minute drive from town, and there's no cell service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been numerous vehicle break-ins at the trailheads, with gravel parking lots sometimes sparkling with bits of broken glass from what I assume were car windows. Occasionally, you'll see some sketchy individuals hanging around these trailheads or driving along the rough Forest Service roads. These roads are rugged, and you might encounter dilapidated cars barreling along paths made for four-wheel drive vehicles. Some of the folks you see in those cars resemble the character who got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. Despite this, it's still a fantastic place to camp. You just have to be cautious. A few years back, two of my friends, Tom and Jake, decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. Probably not the most legal choice, I know. We turned the paintball outing into a camping trip so we could play again the next morning. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paint at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group had taken all the sites, and this was really the only camping spot we knew, and it was getting late. So we kept looking, driving further into the woods for about an hour. By now, it was getting dark, and we were starting to worry about finding a place to set up camp. We had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had service. We turned onto an unfamiliar road that was in bad shape. It looked like the forest rangers had blocked off the road with a mound of dirt. Nearby, there was a broken metal barrier indicating that four-wheel drive vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. My truck had a decent clearance, so we decided to go over the hill. On the other side, we found an old gravel road that was mostly clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and discovered an opening beside a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed odd. Still, it was getting dark, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night, so we left the truck's lights on and set up the tent. As we were setting up, I noticed a lot of trash in the woods around us. I spotted a green bottle on the ground and looked at the label. It was a bottle of garden insecticide. At the time, I was tired and thought someone had dumped their trash out here. None of us thought it was strange that someone would leave garbage in such a remote area. After setting up camp, we had some beers and made chili from scratch. By now, it was probably around 11 p.m. While eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering through the trees, but the angles didn't make sense. It wasn't bright and didn't move. It looked more like the glow from a distant city. Since there were no other access roads nearby, we decided it wasn't from other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, and we felt curious enough to investigate. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have gone, but after a few rum and cokes, Tom and I decided to check it out while Jake stayed behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. As we approached the light, things started to feel stranger. All the trees around had their bark stripped off in circles around their trunks. We wondered if a beaver might have done it, but it seemed odd that a beaver would knock the bark off multiple trees. As we neared the top of the hill, we joked about a ghostly beaver, probably due to our drunkenness. Just then, Tom tripped and yelled, "Oh no!" A few seconds after he shouted, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and thought maybe we didn't need to see what that light was after all. We quietly walked back, glancing behind us every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlights and use the moonlight to find our way back to camp. When we got a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I could see Jake wandering around. He wore a hooded coat I didn't recognize and was carrying his paintball gun. That seemed a little odd to me. The fire had dimmed, so we couldn't see the campsite well. It looked like he was searching for something, walking around and peering into the tent. When we got back, we sat by the fire and waited for him to return. Suddenly, we saw him stagger out of the tent, stumble a few feet, and throw up. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. When we asked him why he was wandering around with a paintball gun, he gave us a strange look. "That's locked up in the truck," he replied. We checked the truck and entered the door code. Everything was just as we left it, including the paintball equipment. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. A sinking feeling hit me. "Jake, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. "I was watching something on my phone, then fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you change jackets?" Jake insisted he had been in the tent since we left and was wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. That meant someone had been roaming around our campsite, and it wasn't Jake. At that point, we were too drunk to drive, but we decided to pack up and head back to my place for the night. We didn't bother taking the tent down. We just folded it with the sleeping bags and everything inside. I started driving out, and when we reached the dirt mound, we saw something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods was now back in place, sitting right on top of the mound. By then, we had all sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to get out of the truck to move the barrier. My truck had a metal guard in front, so I slowly drove forward, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It fell right off, almost like it had just been balanced on top, and we drove over it cautiously. We were terrified it would puncture one of the truck's tires, but thankfully it didn't. As we drove down the road, we noticed a vehicle following us with its lights off, about 1,000 feet behind us. It stayed right behind us, keeping pace but not getting any closer. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding down the gravel roads, we finally reached the main paved road. I started driving everyone home, deciding to take a different route just to be safe. I was relieved not to get pulled over for a DUI. Camping can be fun, but rural camping can also be risky. I've driven past that metal barrier since then, but it's always been in place. I would never venture down that road again. This is a memory I have from a few years back. At the time, I was somewhat known at school, but I had about 4 very close friends: Rosie, Lily, Nick, and Josh. We shared many adventures during that period, including camping trips, road excursions, and beach days. Nick's family had a good amount of money, and all our families were pretty easygoing with rules. One summer, just before my last year of middle school, we planned a camping trip with Lily's older sister, Mia, and Josh's older brother, Tom. So we were 7 in total. Lily, Josh, and I were 13, while Nick and Rosie were 14, and Mia and Tom were both 17. We chose a campsite in a nearby forest about 20 miles from Nick's house, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Nick's neighborhood was the closest one, and we had no phone signal or access to any electronic devices. We arrived at our campsite without any trouble and set up camp. The girls stayed in one tent, and the boys were in another. It might not have been the best idea to have several teens aged 13 to 17 without phones in the woods, but our parents trusted us since the area wasn't known for any danger. After pitching our tents, we went swimming in a nearby lake, then returned to cook dinner over a fire that was about 20 feet from our tents, which were 40 feet apart. We enjoyed s'mores and all the usual camping activities until Lily and Mia decided to turn in for the night. That left Tom, Rosie, Josh, Nick, and me. We shared jokes, told scary stories, and had a blast. Then Mia approached, looking annoyed, saying that someone was messing with the side of their tent. Keep in mind that no one had left the group, and the tents were far enough apart that they shouldn't have bothered anyone. She explained that something kept touching the side of it and making a noise. We dismissed her concerns, and Tom suggested it was probably just a tree branch. Rosie and I then decided to head to our tent as well. I crawled into the tent where Lily was already asleep and settled in with me closest to the entrance, Mia next to Lily on the opposite side, and Rosie in between us. I quickly fell asleep, but suddenly woke up for no apparent reason. I checked my phone, which I had brought along with a portable charger to take pictures. It was the middle of the night, around 2:15 a.m. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a soft tapping sound on the tent, along with some quiet giggling. It seemed like a deep male voice, but I couldn't be sure. After what felt like an eternity but was likely just a couple of minutes, the tapping and giggling stopped. I convinced myself it was just my imagination or perhaps one of the boys trying to prank us, so I went back to sleep. The next thing I knew, Rosie was waking me up at dawn. Everyone was awake, and we decided to take a hike for a bit. We split into two groups since we planned to camp another night and didn't want anyone tampering with our stuff. Although this area wasn't known for heavy camping, we wanted to be safe. Mia, Lily, Rosie, and I went hiking for a few hours while the boys stayed behind to fish, swim, and cook. About 2 hours later, we returned to find the boys not at the campsite. Margot went down to the lake to look for them, while Rosie and I headed back to the tents. I'll admit I screamed and nearly panicked when I saw the tents had been slashed. After regaining my composure, since I usually stayed calm in stressful situations, I inspected the damage more closely. The cuts were made with a small knife as they were tiny, and our tents were made of tough material. It seemed someone had used a pocket knife. The boys, along with Margot and Lily, rushed to us, startled by our screams. We all agreed to pack up and head home early. The tents were too damaged to use comfortably, and we were all pretty shaken, especially when Tom revealed that his tires had also been slashed. In a state of panic, we realized we had no cell service, Tom's tires were destroyed, and we definitely didn't want to stick around any longer. Fortunately, Tom reported that Margot's tires seemed fine, and she offered to take Nick and drive them to call the police and their parents, then come back for the rest of us. Since her car was filled with camping gear, there wasn't enough room for everyone. So, Josh, Tom, Rosie, and I began hiking back toward the main road, wanting to help Margot avoid a long drive. I didn't want to stay near the camping area either. As we hiked, my phone died. The last time I checked, it was around 1 p.m. Josh and Rosie still had their phones and kept us updated on how far we were walking. As time passed, I started hearing branches snapping behind us, which made me more paranoid. I mentioned it to Tom, who became more cautious and kept glancing over his shoulder. We had been walking for about 30 minutes, and I figured Margot was probably nearing Nick's house when suddenly, Tom yelled, "Run!" I instinctively looked back before bolting. 3 hooded figures were chasing us, and I could see 2 of them had knives. They looked to be around 6 feet 3 inches or taller. Tom was 6 feet 1 inch, but I doubted he could defend us all against them, even in broad daylight. I couldn't make out any facial features, but they all seemed to weigh over 200 pounds. The shortest was probably about 6 feet 2 inches. They wore hoods and ski masks. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I was terrified. We took off running, and thankfully, the 3 figures either gave up or decided we weren't worth the chase, as we managed to lose them. We reached the main road and waited, constantly looking back in fear until Margot arrived. We told the police everything, and they searched the woods nearby. Unfortunately, They found no evidence of our presence or any trace of the hooded figures, except for pictures of the lake and the shredded tents. I often wonder what would have happened if they had caught up with us. I was about 5 feet 10 inches at the time and weighed only 125 pounds, while Rosie was around 5 feet 1 inch and 100 pounds, and Josh was barely 5 feet 9 inches and probably outweighed me by just 10 pounds. I'm so grateful that I warned Tom about the figures. If he hadn't been paying attention, I have no doubt they would have caught us. I'm also thankful that we all regularly exercised, which helped us outrun them. To understand my story, you first need to know a little bit about the trespassing laws in our country. Essentially, we don't have strict ones. As long as you're respectful and don't damage anything, you can walk on any hill or, in my case, camp on any beach you want. The only rule is to leave everything as you found it. When I was younger, I loved camping. My family went several times a year, usually with a group of my parents' friends and their kids. Altogether, there were usually around 10 of us, which made it a bit tricky because we'd always camp at this really remote beach. Actually, we weren't the only ones there. There were often yachts just off the shore and other campers along the beach. Most of them had kids or teens too, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was more like a relaxed family vacation spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers that had been put up, even though we were in the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council got tired of people using the bushes as bathrooms. We took one of our camping trips in the spring of 2013. I'm not great with dates, but I remember this because I got my dog during the winter of 2012. I had picked her from a shelter as a birthday present to myself and paid the adoption fee. Let me tell you about her. My dog, who I named Bree, came to me as a 6-month-old puppy. She had been rescued from a bad situation where dogs were being used for fighting. We're not completely sure of her breed, but I think she's a mix of Greyhound and Staffordshire Terrier. She's super friendly with people and most dogs, but if you cross her, she's not one to back down. By the time we went on this camping trip, I'd had Bree for a few months, but she had never gone camping with us before. In my family, though, dogs always come on camping trips, so she joined us. That time, none of our family friends could make it, so it was just me, my sister, and our parents. I didn't mind, though. I wasn't too attached to the other kids, and I had my dog and my sister to keep me company. The drive to the beach took about 6 hours. We left later than usual, though I can't remember why, so we arrived just as the sun was setting. It wasn't an ideal time to set up a tent, but we expected to find other campers already there with their campfires lighting up the beach. Oddly, the beach was completely empty. Despite this, my parents started unloading the car and setting up the tent. They asked my sister and me to get some of the lighter bags from the car. Before I got out, I rolled down the window for Bree because it was warmer than usual for that time of year. As we fumbled around in the dark, it felt eerie. The beach was in the middle of nowhere, and the road that led to it was shaped like a big loop with a bridge over the water. You could circle around the beach if you wanted to. After about 15 minutes of my dad trying to stake the tent into the sand, my mom asked, "Did you see that car drive around? It's been by a few times." My dad shrugged it off like he usually does. A few minutes later, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. They were about 15 or 20 feet away from us. It was dark, except for the light from our flashlights, so we weren't expecting to see anyone. My mom said, "Maybe it's security." I don't know why she thought a random beach would have security, but maybe she meant someone from a local wildlife group since they sometimes check the area. The guy walking toward us wasn't steady on his feet. He looked drunk or high, stumbling as he moved closer. As he came into the light, we saw he was holding a large knife at least 15 inches long. Though I was young, I could tell it was big. My dad stood up immediately, grabbing a camping mallet, and put us behind him. The man started yelling at us, saying we couldn't camp there. My dad, trying to stay calm, said we'd leave. But the man kept moving closer, and my dad started yelling back. My sister and I were terrified. We were crying and shaking. It really felt like they were about to fight, and I didn't think my dad stood much of a chance. Honestly, I was sure that if this man attacked my dad, he would hurt us all. But things didn't turn out that way. Bree, my dog, acted fast, like a wolf protecting her pack. She lunged at the man and bit down hard on his arm. She tore through his jacket, and the skin underneath was shredded. He dropped the knife because it was in the arm she bit. He kicked and punched her, eventually shaking her off. He grabbed the knife from the ground and ran back to his car, speeding off. We quickly packed up our things and got into the car, all shaken by what had just happened. I checked Bree over. She was okay, but the window I had left slightly open for her was now much wider. We figured that when the shouting started, she must have put her paws on the gap and pushed the window down enough to squeeze through. It was an old car with manual windows, so that was possible. But that wasn't the end of it. We were scared and didn't want to camp anymore. Since we had Bree with us, we couldn't stay in a hotel, so my parents decided to drive home. First, though, we needed to get gas as we were running low. While my dad drove, I cleaned Bree up a bit. I had always loved dogs, but what she did for us that night amazed me. As we drove into the nearest town, we found a gas station, but it looked closed. My dad pulled up to check the sign for when it would open, sticking his head out the window. My mom asked him what he was doing, and he said he was trying to see the hours. My heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van, where we hadn't noticed him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting in his car, trying to clean his arm with some tissues. It looked bad. Without stopping for gas, my dad quickly drove off. He decided to head to the next town, which was about 60 miles away. But as we drove, we realized we didn't have enough gas to make it. "It's fine," my dad said. "We have roadside assistance." We figured we'd break down and call for help, but at least we'd be away from that guy. After a few minutes of driving, we noticed headlights behind us. It was the same car, and the man was following us. He must have known we were low on gas. The next 30 minutes were the scariest of my life. My parents tried to stay calm for our sake, but we weren't little kids anymore. We knew how serious the situation was. The man followed us for 50 miles before finally turning off onto another road. We were driving on empty for the last 10 miles, but somehow we made it to a gas station. We filled up the tank and made it the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car, exhausted. The next day, after getting some rest, my mom called the non-emergency police line to report what happened. They never followed up, but the officer she spoke to said the man matched the description of a suspect wanted for a murder charge. We never found out if it was him or just some dangerous stranger. The lesson I took from this: I love my dog even more. Bree is still with us today, and I have no idea what was going through her mind that night, but I'm grateful for her bravery. This is a story from a few years ago. It all began when my close friend and I talked about how we needed to go camping again soon. We loved spending time outdoors and aimed to camp a few times each month. It was late November in West Virginia, which can be either unseasonably warm or quite chilly. That year, it was very chilly. Our partners had been giving us a hard time about never taking them camping. We typically did a lot of basic camping in cold, damp conditions, and we were surprised they even wanted to join us. To us, the tougher the conditions, the better the trip, just a typical manly ego, I suppose. I was honestly thrilled they wanted to come along, so we made plans to go camping that weekend. When Saturday came, we had everything packed and were eager to return to the great outdoors. We hopped on the highway for about 2.5 hours, heading west into the mountains. As we got closer to our hidden camping location, the temperature dropped, and it started to rain. I noticed my partner getting anxious about the fading daylight and the challenge of setting up camp in those conditions. Since my friend and I were used to this, we reassured her that it would be fine. We arrived at our secret spot, which was really just a scenic overlook where you could park and admire the beautiful mountains. By this time, it was dark, and all we could see were the lights of a city far away. Anyone familiar with the mountains knows how quickly it can get dark once the sun sets behind the peaks. It was still raining and cold, and I guessed it was around 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was howling as we unloaded the car, and I could see our partners' moods changing from excitement to confusion, wondering why they had wanted to join us. To explain the camping spot, there was a small path that led from the scenic overlook down a steep rocky decline. It was about 75 feet down from where we parked. This wasn't an official trail. You could picture it as a place where teenagers might park and wander down to smoke or hang out. Camping there wasn't legal, but we were young and reckless. We felt we had a hidden gem, so to speak, and it was tricky to navigate down there, so we always took our time to avoid injuries. I took out all my gear and got ready to head down the path. My partner and I walked about 50 yards away from the car to the trail's entrance. We set down our backpacks and waited for my friend and his girlfriend. A few minutes went by, and we wondered what was taking them so long, especially since it was raining and cold, making us a little impatient. After about 5 to 10 minutes, I thought, "What's going on?" I left my partner standing there and walked back to the car. I could hear my friend and his girlfriend arguing. "What's wrong? What are you doing?" I asked. She replied, "He locked the keys in the car." Well, great. It was nearly 10 p.m., freezing, raining, and we had no cell service. The closest town was 20 minutes away. I was immediately frustrated because the last thing we needed right now was a situation like this. I returned to my partner to fill her in. Unfortunately, she has a joint condition that makes her sore in cold or humid weather, and I could see her wincing in discomfort. I called out to my friend, letting him know we were going down to get a fire started since she was clearly uncomfortable. My main concern was getting her warm, and I promised I'd return soon to help him sort out the car issue. We switched on our headlamps and slowly began descending the steep, rocky path. Remember, it was raining, and the worst part was the mist. It practically made our headlamps useless, as they lit up the fog around us and obscured our view. I held onto her gear while she went down to get mine, and we repeated this process for about 20 minutes, slowly making our way to the bottom. Although this was a bit of a hassle, we were getting there. After another 10 minutes of this, we were close to where we typically set up camp when she suddenly said, "What's that?" I could hear fear in her voice. I squinted down the rocky decline through the fog and spotted a tarp. "Oh, awesome. Free tarp," I thought. I figured someone at the top must have lost it during the wind, so I got excited. As I crept closer to grab it, I noticed something that caught my eye, a handheld shopping basket from a grocery store. I couldn't tell what was in it, but it looked like snack wrappers. I turned back to my partner, and she looked like she was about to cry. "Is there someone under that tarp?" she asked. I assured her that it couldn't be possible. We were in the middle of nowhere, the only car parked up there, and it was freezing and raining. There was no fire, no gear, no tent, nothing. We weren't near any main roads or trails, so there's no way it was a passing hiker or a homeless person. Besides, who could sleep on a 35-degree incline on slate stones? I inched closer to grab the tarp, intending to prove she was overreacting. But when my light hit it, it moved. We both froze like statues. My mind couldn't accept the idea of someone actually sleeping on the side of this hidden cliff with no gear in those conditions. It had to be the wind. My eyes were playing tricks on me. I glanced back at my partner, and she was slowly backing up the slope. When I turned back to the tarp, it moved again. That wasn't the wind. Someone was waking up under that tarp. My heart raced, and I turned to my partner, whispering urgently, "Run!" Before I could finish my sentence, she was scrambling up the loose rocks. I heard a half-asleep, gravelly moan from below and took off after her. I stopped as she went ahead, turning off my light to listen. I could hear someone shifting around down there. They were awake and moving. Had we woken them up? Would they follow us? I tried to stay calm despite my fear and wondered if this person was lost or in trouble. I called out, "Are you okay? We can help if you need it." But there was only silence. At that point, I thought, "Forget this," and kept moving. We hurried back to the car, and my partner was in tears, rightfully scared. My mind raced, trying to figure out what that person was doing there. No gear, no shelter, no car, no fire. When we told our friends what had happened, they were freaked out, especially since we couldn't even get into the car to leave, thanks to my friend locking the keys inside. Love you for that, by the way. The rain picked up, and we were huddled under a tarp for warmth while my friend searched for cell service. I sat there, staring at the trailhead in case that person came up. Eventually, my friend managed to reach a locksmith. I can't even describe how much he had to pay for after-hour service, but someone finally arrived. We explained what had happened, and he told us to get out of there and find another place to camp. He had lived in the area for years and started telling us about various mysterious murders and missing hikers over the years. He said something along the lines of how some people hide out there for a reason. We didn't camp that night. Everyone was too scared, so we drove back home in silence. I still lie awake some nights, wondering what that person was doing there. Were they running from the law? Were they just an unprepared camper? How did they end up there without a car? Why didn't they have a fire if they were camping? They were just lying on the side of a cliff in freezing rain, surrounded by darkness. I wish I could convey what kind of place we were in. It's not somewhere a homeless person could survive. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that humans are often more dangerous than animals. I had heard that before, but this was the first time I truly felt it. It made me think about all the mistakes I made. I never should have taken my partner there at night to camp in an unmarked area. The darkness, the rain, and the lack of cell service were all poor choices on my part. I had too much confidence in my camping skills and didn't consider external dangers. If something had gone wrong, no one would have found us. I was selfish, arrogant, and naive. So much could have ended badly if that person had wanted to hurt us. I don't camp at night anymore, and our partners no longer pressure us about taking them along. We have never returned to that spot. This is a story from May 2010. I had just split from my girlfriend of nearly 3 years. We had relocated from Calgary to Toronto, and we were still cohabiting after the breakup since we hadn't met many people in the city yet. To say the situation was tense and upsetting would be an understatement. A friend from school suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, and I eagerly accepted. He grew up near a place called Flamborough, about an hour outside Toronto, which is known for its stunning scenery, with dense forests, farmland, and small rivers. We decided to camp and fish along a stream named Grindstone Creek, which is near some wetlands known for great fishing. We ended up pitching our tent in what was likely a farmer's field. I suspected we were trespassing, bordered by a beautiful forest. We spent the evening fishing, chatting, and enjoying some good craft beers. As night fell, we lit a small fire to roast potatoes and hot dogs. Overall, it turned out to be a great night, and we went to bed just after midnight. We shared a tent, and my friend fell asleep before I did. I was still awake, playing on my phone until around 1:30 a.m. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to a high-pitched yipping sound. Groggy, it took me a moment to wake up completely. The yipping was relentless and sounded almost like a strange coyote. I lay there for a minute, listening, then resumed playing on my phone. The noise was incredibly annoying, and I tried to ignore it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Eventually, It seemed like it was no more than 10 feet from the tent, which made me a bit uneasy. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before and thought they were mostly harmless, never appearing much bigger than a small dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty severe anxiety disorder, so I tend to worry about these types of things. I nudged my friend to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise had woken him up as well. We debated what to do about the supposed coyote since we hadn't brought anything to scare off animals. Not even a BB gun. Nothing. Finally, he decided to shine the flashlight at it and yell loudly to try to scare it off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him shine the flashlight into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His leg went wobbly, and he stumbled backward into the tent, looking completely stunned. He told me, "It's not a coyote, it's a guy. Some weird guy." Normally, I would have thought he was joking. I'm quite the scaredy cat and can't even watch horror films, but the look on his face was one of pure terror, and I never want to see that expression again. So I knew he wasn't kidding. The strange yipping and howling continued, and looking back, it didn't really sound like a coyote, but in our groggy state, that was how our minds made sense of it. He insisted I peek out the tent flap to see if he was crazy. At that point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack, my heart racing. I felt awful, but I had to look. So I slowly crept to the flap, waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. He was standing just a few feet away from the tent, swaying slightly, wearing a baseball cap. What made it even more disturbing was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I realized something was seriously off with this guy. If making strange noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away, this surely did. After pulling my head back inside the tent, my friend and I talked about what to do. Finally, we decided to shout at him to go away. My friend started yelling, "Hey, get out of here. We're trying to sleep." The noise stopped. It went dead silent. Then we heard footsteps running toward the tent, stopping right outside. We didn't waste any time. We yelled again, "Seriously, leave us alone. We'll call the police." With that, we heard him walk past the tent, heading in the direction of the road. Needless to say, we lay awake, terrified, until we saw the first light of dawn. Then we quickly packed up and got out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home and felt embarrassed about how frightened we had been. I guess it wasn't particularly brave on either of our parts. We were both ashamed for allowing a weirdo to spook us so much, so we haven't talked about it since that day. So there you go, that's my strange story. I often wonder what that guy was doing out there or what was wrong with him. Sometimes I think about whether things would have turned out differently if we had been a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was a serial killer, but it seemed like he was testing who was in that tent. I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm actually quite relieved. My spouse and I went camping for the first time in New Mexico as part of a longer trip across the West. I chose a spot on a mountain that had an amazing view of the desert below. The place was quite remote, around 25 miles down rough, gravel roads in the heart of a national forest. We arrived, set up our tent, and took a short hike to explore. We noticed a few cars parked nearby, and we decided to chat with some of the other campers. We heard there was a storm coming that night, so we talked to 4 local men who assured us it wouldn't be too bad in that area. That was all the convincing we needed to stay. Later, while walking a bit further down the trail, we spotted a woman with her dog and another person. We waved and continued our hike. Since the storm was approaching, only 7 of us stayed for the night. As the sun set, we returned to our campsite and made sure our car was nearby. When it got too dark to see, we crawled into our tent. There were no stars that night due to the clouds, and though it hadn't started raining yet, we figured we'd try to sleep early to get through the storm. The wind was wild, making it hard to sleep, but we managed to doze off for a bit. I woke up at around 10:30 p.m. to the sound of loud thunder and rain pouring on our tent. I was a little scared, worrying about flash floods or falling off the cliff nearby. Still, I convinced myself to relax and fell asleep again. Then, at midnight, I woke up once more. This time, I heard something heavy hitting the side of our tent, almost like someone was pushing against it. I opened my eyes, but it was pitch dark. The sound continued every few minutes, and I was terrified. Suddenly, I heard slow footsteps just outside our tent. My entire body froze, and I began to panic, thinking this might be the end. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. Then, whatever it was let out a deep sigh right on the other side of the tent. I thought it might be a bear and knew I had to be ready to deal with it. Desperately, I squeezed my spouse's hand hard, hoping they would wake up without me saying anything. But instead, they groggily asked, "Why are you squeezing my hand?" Just as they spoke, the footsteps stopped. After calming down a bit, I explained what I heard. We tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal passing by, but the odd sound against the tent kept coming. Slowly, we began to believe it was probably just pine cones falling from the trees. We tried to go back to sleep, telling ourselves we just needed to make it through the night and we'd laugh about it in the morning. A few minutes later, though, the tent suddenly caved in on my spouse's side, right on their head. They whispered that it felt like something was pressing down on the tent. I panicked, thinking it was a bear, but my spouse pushed back, and we heard the familiar sound of something sliding off. We realized it had been snowing, and what we heard hitting the tent was ice falling from the trees. Our tent was covered in thick ice. My spouse pushed the tent from the inside until the ice slid off. Relieved that it was just ice and not a bear, we decided to try to sleep again and make it to sunrise. We kept a small light on, which helped calm us down a little. Things were starting to feel normal again. At around 3 a.m., just as we were settling in, the worst thing happened. Out of the darkness, we heard a woman screaming. We clearly heard her shout, "What the hell? Oh my God, what the hell?" Followed by some unintelligible words that sounded like, "Help." The way she screamed wasn't angry. It was pure terror. My spouse and I froze, staring at each other. I quickly turned off the light and started panicking, wondering what we should do. After a few minutes of silence, we heard her again, this time shouting, "No, no, no, no." As we heard a car speeding off, I was in tears at this point, completely unsure of what was happening. The only sound left was the icy rain hitting our tent. It didn't seem like she was in the car, but more like she was begging someone not to hurt her. That was it for me. I could deal with the bad weather, the possible bear, and even the ice falling on our tent. But a screaming person in the middle of the woods at 3 a.m. was too much. We decided to leave immediately. We quickly gathered our valuables and shuffled to the car. I shut the door and kept the lights off, trying not to attract attention. While my spouse went back to grab the tent, I started the car and called 911. I explained what we had heard and where we were. They told us they would send someone to check on the campsite, but it would take over an hour since we were so remote, and the storm had made the roads rough. We began driving away, and as we left the campsite, my spouse noticed something chilling. The 4 men we had spoken to earlier were gone. All 3 of their cars had disappeared, but their tents were still there. Whatever scared them off, they had left in a hurry. As we drove away, I realized that whatever had been walking near our tent earlier might not have been an animal. It could have been someone lurking in the darkness, who later targeted the woman we had seen earlier. I still don't know what happened that night, and I hope everyone made it out safely. In May 2015, I went camping with my boyfriend at the time, who we'll call Jay, along with another couple who were friends of mine. We decided to head out to a place called Pine Ridge State Park, located at the southernmost part of Virginia. The campground was pretty big, with 3 different loops of campsites. 2 loops were set more in the woods, while the loop we chose was right by the water. Our loop had fewer campers, with only 1 other tent nearby. Pine Ridge State Park is mostly flat and borders a large bay, with a lot of the area being marshland. There's also an old lighthouse not too far from the loop, just a quick drive away. I hadn't done any research on the park before we went. I was just glad to have a break since I was going through a tough time. We set up camp at what seemed like the best spot, right by the water but far enough from the road that no one could see us. Tall grass acted like a curtain, blocking anyone's view of us, making it the perfect place to relax without being disturbed. IT was my first camping trip, and Jay wasn't that into it either, so we set up a flimsy tent, but it didn't really matter since we spent most of our time outside it anyway. We walked around and explored the area, strolling through the campground loops and along the shoreline. The scenery was beautiful, but there was a strange, almost eerie vibe about the place that I couldn't quite put into words. It felt heavy, like a stillness that seemed unnatural. At one point, I left the group to use the restroom. As I was walking down the path, I swear I saw this massive tortoise slowly crossing in front of me. It was huge, and as it walked, it seemed to lock eyes with me. It wasn't really a scary moment, but something about it felt off. When I came out of the bathroom, the tortoise was gone, even though it had been moving at a snail's pace. The first night was pretty uneventful, aside from the fierce wind that swept through the park. As I mentioned, the park sits right by the bay, and it's on flat land, so strong winds are pretty common. Unfortunately, because we hadn't set up the tent properly, it flapped around all night, making us feel like it might blow away with us inside. I barely slept. On the second day, we decided to check out the old lighthouse. Since it was spring, they were offering guided tours for a few hours during the day. The tour guide gave us a brief history of the lighthouse and shared some interesting facts. One thing that stuck with me, though the guide brushed over it quickly, was that the man who originally built the lighthouse and the next 2 owners all died not long after moving in. The guide didn't seem to think much of it, but it left an impression on me. We spent the rest of the day hiking, drinking, smoking, and generally enjoying ourselves. When it was time to go to bed, things started to get weird. That night, the wind was completely gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, it was the type that makes you nervous. Despite that, I fell asleep quickly since I hadn't slept much the night before. Not long after I drifted off, Jay shook me awake, looking concerned. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "No, what happened?" I replied. He said, "I heard someone yell, 'Hey,' right outside the tent. I think there's a man outside." At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was the other couple talking since their tent was close to ours. But then I heard one of them snoring loudly, so loud that even the other campers could probably hear it. That meant they were fast asleep and couldn't have been the ones talking. That I was skeptical at first, thinking Jay might have imagined it since we'd been drinking and smoking. But then I heard it, footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking around our tent. The sound of heavy boots crunched along the gravel. It wasn't just in our heads. This was real. We looked at each other, wondering who was outside our tent and why they were there. The mesh window of our tent was open so we could see outside. We scanned the area, following the sound of the footsteps with our eyes, but we never saw anyone. I had chills as the footsteps moved further down the path and eventually faded away. Jay and I just looked at each other and whispered, "What was that?" We left the next day as planned and told our friends what had happened. They hadn't heard a thing, which wasn't surprising, given how deeply they slept. They probably could have slept through a thunderstorm. Once I got home, I decided to look up more about the park, and everything started to click. Pine Ridge used to be a Civil War prison camp, with the bodies of soldiers buried throughout the park. The camp was notorious for its horrible conditions and overcrowding. There were also rumors of torture, especially in the lighthouse's basement. There have been countless ghost sightings reported, with people hearing or seeing figures walking around. Some even questioning park guests. I'm convinced that what we experienced was one of those ghostly encounters. The heavy boots and the loud "hey" we heard matched other people's descriptions of strange happenings in the park. There are also stories of a woman seen walking along the beach, asking people where her headstone is and if they can help her find it. As it turns out, a woman buried in a nearby cemetery had her headstone stolen, and it was found years later in a hotel in Washington, D.C. It was never returned, so I imagine she'll keep searching for it until it's put back where it belongs. Now that I know the history of the park, I actually want to go back. For anyone who's been to Pine Ridge, have you experienced anything unusual there? I'd love to hear more stories. Thanks for sharing mine. In the autumn of 2017, a friend and I decided to go for a hike late one afternoon in a heavily wooded nature reserve within a state park in the hills not far from Lincoln, Missouri. My friend, Tom, was nearing 55 at the time and was recovering from a major heart surgery he had undergone about 18 months earlier. We had been hiking regularly since his operation to help improve his heart health. That particular day, a weekday, I brought along just a water bottle, my wallet, and my keys, but nothing else for protection. The trail we picked was popular and usually had a good number of people on weekends. We had hiked this area many times before, and neither of us had ever encountered any issues on this or any other trail. Though Tom was older and still regaining his strength, I was in my mid-40s, stood over 6 feet tall, and was in decent shape, so I wasn't too concerned about our safety. This state park was adjacent to a national forest and was a haven for outdoor enthusiasts. Most of our hike that day was uneventful. We took in the vibrant fall colors and casually chatted as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We hadn't seen anyone else that day, which wasn't surprising since we had chosen to hike in the late afternoon on a weekday. After completing about 4 miles of a 6-mile loop, everything had been as peaceful as usual. On our way back, about 2 miles from the parking lot, we noticed someone through a gap in the trees. It was a young woman, possibly a college student, heading toward us. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her, but as the distance between us shortened, something about her posture and facial expression seemed unusual. As she came closer, I could see that she had a somewhat panicked look on her face and was moving quickly. She was dressed in athletic wear, so I figured she might just be running for exercise. But she kept glancing over her shoulder, which caught my attention. Following her gaze, I noticed another person about 50 yards behind her, walking along the same trail. This second person was another woman, but something about her was off. She wasn't wearing hiking gear. Instead, she was dressed in clothes that seemed totally inappropriate for the setting. It was a warm afternoon, we were deep in the woods, and yet this woman was wearing what looked like office casual clothes, including a light jacket. Her outfit was worn and didn't seem clean. She looked to be fit and in her mid-20s or early 30s. Everything about her appearance seemed wrong, including the scuffed leather flats she wore, which were completely unsuitable for hiking. Tom hadn't noticed anything unusual. He was engrossed in conversation. The second woman glanced up briefly as she approached us, making eye contact with me, and suddenly, I felt a wave of discomfort. Something about her look unsettled me deeply. I wasn't sure what was going through her mind, but it felt hostile. Trying to shake off the unease, I averted my eyes, telling myself that maybe she was homeless or just wearing what she could. But despite my attempts to rationalize it, alarm bells were going off in my head. I'm not a paranoid person, but I have good peripheral vision, so I pretended to keep listening to Tom while keeping an eye on the woman. As we passed her, she turned her head sharply to watch us. My unease only grew. After we had walked about 50 yards past her, I glanced back and saw her standing there, staring at us with her face lowered, watching us out of the corner of her eyes. That's when I realized I couldn't see her hands. One was tucked inside her jacket pocket, and the other was hidden behind her body. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. For the next half-mile, we didn't see her again, and I started to wonder if the first woman had sensed danger too. Clearly, she had, which is why she had been moving so fast. It dawned on me that the creepy woman had stopped to assess whether to follow us. Since Tom and I were moving slower, she might have thought we were easier targets. I began checking behind us more frequently, and at one point, I saw her again about 100 yards back, walking briskly with her head down, hands still hidden. Each time we went around a bend and she disappeared from view, she would reappear closer. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I subtly encouraged Tom to pick up the pace. Eventually, he became aware that we were being followed, and though he was uncomfortable, he kept talking. With only about half a mile left to the parking lot, I glanced back once more, and this time, she was only about 10 feet behind us. Her approach had been completely silent. One hand remained in her jacket pocket, and the other was hidden behind her back. I got the distinct feeling she had a weapon, and despite my size, she didn't seem intimidated at all. Her demeanor was threatening, as though she meant to do us harm. I slipped my car keys between my fingers and made a fist. I handed my water bottle to Tom and braced myself for a confrontation. But instead of passing us, she continued to follow us closely, never acknowledging our presence, which made the situation even more unsettling. Finally, I had enough. I loudly told Tom we were going to stop and let her pass, making sure she could hear me. Just as we were about to stop, she veered off the trail into some brush, crossed a ditch, and disappeared through a line of trees toward a service road that cut through the woods. I kept my eyes on her the whole time and noticed she had a car parked along that road, partially hidden by some shrubs. The last time we made eye contact, she seemed furious. I stared back, equally angry. As her car drove off, Tom turned to me and asked, "What was she planning to do? Did she have a gun?" I didn't know, but I was glad she had decided not to follow us any further. We made it back to the car in silence, then decided to call the authorities to report the incident, just in case. To this day, I have no idea what that woman intended, but I'm thankful it didn't escalate. I've hiked that trail more than 50 times since, but I've never seen her again. Hi, Swamp Dweller. My name is Alex. In the summer of 2018, I moved to southern Alabama, near the Barlow marshlands. There are tons of snakes and gators all over the place here. For those who may not know, it's one of the largest wetlands in the U.S., spreading across the southeastern edge of the state and reaching into northern Mississippi. Anyway, my house sits on the edge of a creek, about 12 miles away from a national reserve. It's surrounded by thick woods, and the 4-bedroom home is pretty secluded. Most nights, as I relax on my upper deck, I can hear the gators hissing in the creek below. The deck is on the second floor, above the lower patio, and doesn't have any stairs leading down, so I feel safe from any wild animals like black bears, coyotes, boars, and even, from what I've heard, the rare panther. One evening, while having my second drink, I heard a strange noise coming from the water. It echoed through the air and sounded like a loud, mournful wail. I thought to myself, this is fresh water. What could make a noise like that in a marsh? The sound came closer to my house, and as it made its final call, everything went silent. The crickets, the frogs, just stopped. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. I had a spotlight on the table next to me, so I grabbed it and shined it toward the water, where I figured the creature might be. What I saw was massive, though I couldn't make out the creature itself. I could only see a huge ripple forming in the water. My heart started racing as I stood up, causing my chair to tip over. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't an alligator. Even the largest 15-foot gator I've ever seen couldn't create such a disturbance. I've hunted gators before with friends, but I'd never encountered anything like this in the marsh. A week later, a friend of mine asked if I wanted to go on a gator hunt. At first, I hesitated, still shaken by what I had seen, but eventually, I agreed. I asked my wife if it was okay, and since she didn't have any plans, I joined him on his boat. We started the day by checking his crawfish traps. As I loaded the rifle and placed our 30 gator tags in a box, I told him about the strange encounter I had. I asked if he'd ever experienced anything like it. He stopped the boat as we neared the 6th trap and told me that his cousin had died under mysterious circumstances involving a creature like the one I had heard. This happened 4 years ago on a quiet night, and no one had ever figured out what happened. No one has ever seen the creature, but the sound it makes is exactly what I'd heard. The way he described it sent shivers down my spine. I felt awful for his loss as he got emotional, and I offered my condolences. After that, he didn't bring it up again, and we continued our day. We caught over 90 pounds of crawfish and managed to snag 12 gators, all between 8 and 10 feet long. It was a productive day. Later that evening, he wanted to head back out on the water to catch some frogs. I reluctantly agreed and brought my .308 rifle just in case. I didn't want him going out there alone, but I was nervous about encountering that creature again. As we got back in the boat, the eerie noise returned, though it was farther off this time. We quickly caught the 18 frogs we needed and began hearing the creature's splashes getting louder. We wasted no time and sped through catching the last few frogs. As soon as we caught the final one, we fired up the boat's engine and hurried out of there. My friend gave me half of the frogs we caught, and the next day our families and friends enjoyed a feast. We both agreed that night to never go out frog catching that late again. We still don't know what that creature was, but the memory of it continues to haunt us. In 2023, my buddy and I made plans for a camping trip. I chose to bring along my dog, Max, a 140-pound Newfoundland mix. Before continuing, it's important to mention that Max is different from most Newfoundlands. He spent the first year of his life living in the wild, which helped him develop great hunting instincts. I found him trapped in my snare lines about a year ago. To cut things short, we built a strong bond during his recovery, and I learned that my new Newfoundland mix could hold his ground in a fight. One afternoon, I came home from work and found 2 coyotes lying dead in the yard. Max had taken care of them. Now he's a sturdy, dependable farm and guard dog. Anyway, one day my friends, let's call them Tom and Eddie, decided to go on a week-long camping trip in southern Alaska. They asked me to join, so we packed up, took time off work, and loaded up my old pickup truck. We headed north. After reaching the wilderness, we shouldered our gear, and I loaded up Max with a small cart I built for him. It allowed him to pull his weight during our summer and fall camping trips, similar to the sled he pulls in winter. The cart carried our tent, sleeping bags, and other light stuff. After covering about 6 miles, we set up camp for the night. I took off Max's harness so he could explore and take care of his needs in the woods. When it was time to eat, I gave Max his dinner while we 3 sat beside the fire, eating beef. Max lay near the fire, resting his head on his paws, quietly watching us. Suddenly, he stood up and let out the loudest, most echoing bark I'd ever heard. The sound echoed through the woods. We looked over and saw some branches shaking, as if something was running away. We figured it might be a raccoon or maybe a bear at worst. Later that night, as we sat chatting, Max had wandered off, probably to relieve himself. Out of nowhere, we heard movement from our left. Thinking it was Max, I looked, but then caught a glimpse of black fur from the corner of my eye on the right. Suddenly, Max came charging through our camp, running straight between us and the campfire. I turned my head just in time to see a man, who appeared to be in his late 50s, rise from the ground with a piece of firewood in his hand, ready to strike. Before he could, Max jumped, crashing right into the man's chest and knocking him to the ground. As soon as the man hit the dirt, Max was already on him. The man realized he was in trouble and tried to scramble for the piece of wood he dropped, but found himself face to face with Max's snarling muzzle. Max stood over the wood, growling. What happened next still seems unreal to me. Max let out a deep, menacing growl before making a deadly lunge for the man's throat, just like he would when hunting. I rushed over to grab Max, while Tom and Eddie helped the man. We searched his belongings and found items that made it clear he wasn't there for a simple camping trip. The man had a wound on his neck, so we decided to cut our trip short and get him to the authorities. We ended up taking him to the hospital, where he stayed for 3 days before being turned over to the police. The man later told the police that he believed God had ordered him to sneak into our tent and kill us while we slept as some kind of sacrifice. He required 3 surgeries before being released from the hospital. To this day, I'm forever thankful for Max. Without him, I don't know what would have happened. So, be careful out there in the wild. Welcome back to the marsh, my friends, and a warm welcome to those who are new. Apologies for my brief absence. I needed a few days to deal with personal matters and recharge. But now I'm back and ready to dive into some eerie and downright bizarre state park and camping horror stories submitted by viewers like you. As always, if you have a tale you'd like to share in a future episode, you can send it to us at marshcreeps.net or the email listed in the description below. I'd be thrilled to feature your story for everyone here in the marsh. Be sure to like this video, subscribe if you're new, and prepare yourself for chilling and strange state park camping stories that will give you goosebumps. Tonight's paranormal story takes place at Fort Warren State Park, shared by Curious J87. For those unfamiliar, Fort Warren State Park is located in the southeastern part of Wyoming, near the town of Grover. It's also close to the Lizard Peak National Preserve. The area has seen its share of violent conflicts between U.S. troops and native tribes, and is the site where Chief Lone Horse was tragically killed. My family has visited the park annually for over 20 years for a reunion, and each of us has our own experiences with the site's supernatural phenomena. These are mine. When I was around 8 or 11 years old, I can't remember my exact age, my family decided to take me on a snipe hunt, which of course was a joke they were all in on. One family member even took me to a nearby natural history museum to get a book on birds to make it seem more real. That night, we went down to an area filled with tall grass near Soldiers Creek. Armed with my bag, stick, and string, I was ready for the hunt. Thankfully, my mother didn't let my brother leave me alone, so he and his friend stayed with me. After a while, I heard rustling in the bag, so I pulled the string tight, and we decided to head back to the cabin. We walked along the dirt road used by the park's maintenance staff and past some of the park's attractions. At one point, we stopped and saw what we thought was one of the adults standing on the right side of the road, waiting for us. The figure had the outline of a head and shoulders, but it looked like it was made of gray mist. It was so dark that we assumed we just couldn't make out the person's features. We called out, "Hey, we're heading back to the cabin," but the figure didn't move. We waited for a while, trying to get their attention, when I finally said, "That's probably just a no trespassing sign or something, not a person." My brother's friend turned on his flashlight and pointed it down the road. "No," he said, "the sign's over there." His flashlight beam revealed the sign in the distance, but when he aimed it at the figure, it was just a gray mass. We ran back to the cabin as fast as we could. When we arrived, we told everyone what we had seen. Some believed us, while others brushed it off as our imaginations. Fast forward to when I was around 13 or 14. I had an old phone, a Nokia that had been recalled because its battery was a little too loose. If you shook it just right, it would shut off because the battery would disconnect. One afternoon, my cousin and I were messing around on the 3rd floor of the house we were staying in. This part of the house had once been the maid's quarters when the building first operated. I was recording a video of us on my phone, but something strange started happening. The video was glitchy, with large black spots appearing on the screen, and it kept skipping as if it was lagging. Later that day, we filmed something outside, and everything worked perfectly fine. Fort Warren is undoubtedly a paranormal hotspot, but unfortunately, it hasn't attracted the attention of any ghost hunting shows that I know of. I'd love to see an investigation team visit the place one day because I'm sure they'd capture some real evidence. I recently went camping with my family at Ridgeview Park in Kauai. We stayed in a cabin located on park grounds because my uncle works with wildlife, though I've never really asked him exactly what he does. The cabin was perched on a hill, overlooking a campsite. I think the camp was called Slate or something like that. As soon as I walked inside, I felt a strange chill, but being the bold person I am, I decided to confront my fear and sleep in that room. Throughout the night, there were moments when it felt like someone wasn't just in the room with me, but almost moving through me. Everyone else in the cabin also randomly got chills and felt cold. The lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own, and strange things happened. When it was finally time to go to bed, everything seemed normal. I was comfortable in my bed, no strange coldness, no uneasy feeling of being watched, just a cozy bed that allowed me to drift off to sleep easily. But around 1 or 2 a.m., I was suddenly woken up by what sounded like a cat crying. I didn't think much of it because there are lots of stray cats around the island. I closed my eyes again. That's when things got weird. I suddenly felt like someone was right on top of me. The energy around me was so strong it hit me in waves. My ears felt a huge amount of pressure, so much that I could only hear my heartbeat. Each wave of pressure made the sensation even more intense. I kept my eyes shut, facing the wall, hoping it would go away. Then my sleeping bag got pulled tight across my neck, and the uneasy feeling turned into a strong urge to get out of there. I tried to yell for it to stop, but no sound came out. Slowly, the pressure lifted, and the presence disappeared. A few moments later, I heard my younger sister, who was sleeping in the larger bed on the other side of the room, whimpering and shifting around. I lay there for hours trying to fall back asleep, but never really could. This was a camping experience at Ridgeview Park that I doubt I'll ever forget. There's definitely something strange about that place.